Hey YouTubers, it's Justin. In this one, we are going to be setting up your system for the Try Django 3.2 series. Now this setup process is going to install Python 3.6 on your machine. Once you install any version of Python, you'll be able to install every version of Python, at least using this method, as you'll see. So be sure to check the timecodes in the description because you'll be able to jump to a Mac setup version or a Windows setup version. After we set up our machine, we will actually install a virtual environment and use that to help isolate our Python projects, which I'll talk a lot more about in the setup sections for your machine. And then we're going to go ahead and start a Django project and put it into VS Code, the actual text editor for VS Code. Now, the reason I actually have this as a separate video altogether has to do with the fact that, well, if you've never done this before, I wanted to keep it in one place, make it nice and easy for everybody to ask questions, get answers, and really just to get your system set up. Once you finish this off, you'll be able to jump right back into the Try Django 3.2 series in the timecode where it makes sense. So my name is Justin. Let me know if you have any questions on this one. I'm going to be taking you step by step and hopefully in a nice pace so you can keep up while also giving you as much detail as possible through this setup process, because it can be a little frustrating. Again, that's why we're doing one single video. So let's go ahead and jump right in. In this one, we are going to be installing Python 3.6 directly from python.org. This is the recommended way to do this. If you've installed Python in any other way, follow along with me. Even if you think that you don't need to. Trust me, just stick with me on this one. Now, of course, this one's for macOS. So if you have a Windows, feel free to skip. If you're already really comfortable with Python and creating Python virtual environments, by all means, you can skip this portion as well. Now, for the rest of us, let's go ahead and even see if we have Python 3.6 on our machine, because you actually might. Now, to do this, we're going to go ahead and open up a program called Terminal. So if you go into Applications, scroll to the very bottom, and you're going to want to look for Utilities, and scroll to the very bottom of that. You're going to go ahead and open up this application called Terminal. Now, yours is probably not going to look like this if you've never opened your machine before. Instead, yours is probably going to look more something along these lines, maybe not with this special character. That's okay. It's still the same machine. It's still the same program. It's not really going to be that much different, so the commands are all going to be roughly the same. I just have mine more presentable for you. Now, to test if we have Python installed, we can type out Python on the command line here. So that's what the terminal is. It's a way to access the command line. So if I hit Python, it brings me into Python 2.7. Notice I hit enter, and now I'm in Python. How do I get out of this? There's several ways to do it. One of them is you could just close this window out. Another one is to hit Command N to open a new window and start a new session. And yet the preferred method of exiting out of Python is literally writing out exit with parentheses and then hit enter. That brings you out of the Python shell. Now, if I've already lost you on this, I feel like you probably need to get some more familiarity with Python itself prior to jumping into this one, as I mentioned in the requirements, but that's a good little litmus test on whether or not that's the case. So we can actually go ahead and do Python 3.6 on macOS. This is not true for other operating systems necessarily, but on macOS, if you do Python 3.6-V, hit enter, you should see something like this. The important parts here are Python 3.6, not 0.8. 0.8 is great, but that's not as important as 3.6. Okay, so if you have this, you're good. You can go. If you don't have this, if you see something more like if I did Python 33.6 and you get this command not found, we need to install Python 3.6. And then if you also see that if you do Python 3-V, as in no 0.6, and you have a different version of Python, well, you could totally use that. But the thing is, Python 3.9 is still a bit newer, and not every third-party package will support it. That's true for 3.7 and 3.8 as well, where 3.6 will have a lot more third-party package support. Django is such a third-party package, so you could totally use Django with 3.6 as well as many other packages. That's why I'm using 3.6, The other reason is to make sure we're all on the same page. So now let's go ahead and answer the question of how do we actually install Python 3.6, or what's the easiest way to do it? So if you go to python.org and go into downloads, click on downloads, you'll see a screen like this. Of course, if you clicked on Mac OS X, you could see a screen like this. So this is really the screen we want to get to. So if you click on downloads, just make sure you click on Mac OS X. And of course, this is the link right here, the actual URL. That might change over time. But the idea here is we want to find the installer version. And you'll have to make sure that you know what version of Mac you're on, if you're on an Intel Mac or the M1 Mac. The vast majority of you in the past would have been on the M1 Mac, the Intel Mac. So there will be a difference on that, hopefully not too much of one. But what I want to do here is I want to search with Command F 3.6. So what I want to find is actual files for the particular release. Notice that 3.6.14 is out, and it came out in June 28th of 2021, but it doesn't have an actual installer on here. So if I just keep searching 3.6, eventually I'll find a version that has an installer. And of course, that's 3.6.8. Not surprisingly, that is the version I have on my machine. So what we see here is a 64-bit one and a 32-bit one. You can go off of the 64-bit one. It actually doesn't really matter which one you use. But notice that there is no version for the Intel version of Mac. That's because this one is not compiled for the M1 version of Mac. It's fun that all of these things change. But anyway, so let's go ahead and download the installer. Again, you can download either one. And we're just going to go ahead and open this up. And we're going to go ahead and install this, right? So a lot of good stuff here. And we really only need to accept all of the basics. And then, of course, you need to give it access to do so. Now, if you are on a machine that you don't own, if you're on a work computer, you're going to need to talk to your IT department. That would be true if you're a student as well that doesn't have their own computer and you need to install Python on it. This is where different versions of Python might already be on your machine and you might be able to use those. Or you could just go ahead and buy yourself a Raspberry Pi, literally a Raspberry Pi, and spend $30 on one of those to get the correct version of Python. Even older versions of Raspberry Pi, perhaps you might have to spend a bit more. That might be a worthwhile cause. But we can talk about that some other time, or let me know in the comments if you need some more advice there. But I'm going to go ahead and let this finish actually installing, and then we'll come right back. Okay, so it finished installing on my machine. And if you go back into applications, what you'll see is a version of Python in here, right? So notice I have several versions of Python. That is completely acceptable. You can totally use several versions of Python. So now let's go ahead and open up that terminal application again. So navigating to applications and then scrolling all the way down into utilities, into terminal. Let's go ahead and open up a new terminal window. So creating a new terminal session means that we will have access to this newly installed version of Python. If you didn't actually open up a new terminal window, you might not have access to that version. So if I do Python 3.6 now and then -v, I still see that Python 3.6. And I can also type out which Python 3.6, and it should give me a general indication of where this is installed. Now the installer does this for us. And of course, if I do which Python and then which Python 3, we're going to see a few different locations. These things we don't have to worry about at this time, right? The main thing is that if I type out Python 3.6-V, I see that version. If you do -v, you will enter the shell and it gives you a bunch of things that looks like an error. So let's go ahead and exit out of that. And now we need to do really the final step in our Python project setup. This is something you'll do with every Python project, in my opinion. You don't always have to do this, but the idea is when we install third-party packages for our Python projects, we need to isolate them from other Python projects that we have on our machine. this isolation is not really isolation, but it is at least giving us some sort of comfort that versions of packages and stuff aren't overriding each other, because that certainly can happen, as we'll see when we develop this a little bit more. So what I want to do is I want to create a folder or a directory where I'm going to store all of my development projects. And if I do mkdir or mkdir and then dev, that is a folder. So it's make directory dev or dev. In my case, it already actually has one. And of course, again, if you're on a Mac computer and you type out open and period, that will actually open up the directory you are currently in, or the location you're in. Notice we haven't changed around directories at all. We will in a minute. But this is my main user. This user is CFE. That's the CFE user for this machine. And there is a folder in here called dev. Now, this folder already has a bunch of stuff, but if you just did this, yours doesn't have a bunch of stuff. It's empty, right? I'm probably telling you something you already know, but that's the case. So what we want to do is we want to change into that dev folder, and we can list things out with ls. So ls shows us what's inside of this folder. And what I see here is a bunch of different folders. We don't have to worry about that right now. Instead, what we have to worry about is making a brand new folder for our project. And this folder is going to be our virtual environment folder. So I'm actually going to redo this exact same virtual environment setup when we start our Django project, which of course we're not doing in this part. We're really just focusing on macOS setup here. So I'm going to go ahead and make a directory, and I'm going to call this PENV, and this is standing for Python environment, or VENV, which is another way to think of this as a virtual environment. But I'll go ahead and call it PENV, and we will go ahead and cd into PENV. Okay, so now if I list things out, I've got nothing in there. If I open it up, I still have nothing in there, right? And if I navigate back to a different folder, what I can see is it's inside of that dev folder. And again, I can go into my users folder here, navigate to that dev folder, and then navigate to that PENV folder, empty folder, completely empty. Okay, so here is where we actually create our virtual environment. We type out Python 3.6 -m as in dash module, and then we use VENV. So this module does sound a lot like the folder name that we're about to use, but this is actually a way that Python has built into it. I think as soon as Python 3.4 or so, Python has a way built into it to keep our project's dependencies somewhat isolated. So what this is doing is it's going to say, hey, Python 3.6, create a virtual environment using the module of VENV, and we're going to do it in this folder by using this period here. Now, part of the reason I was opening up the current directory is to show you what that period does in other places. This is just a simple and easy way to do that right here. So I hit enter, and it's going to take a moment, and it seems like nothing happened. But now if I list everything out with ls, I see all of these different folders and file. This right here is a file, and these are folders. And of course, we can verify that by actually opening it up in the Finder, and we can see folders and file. There's another command that we can use, which is ls-al. This gives me a little bit better of what's going on with this, as well as certain permissions. That is definitely outside the scope of this one right here. But the general idea is there are other commands that are built in to the terminal or built into the command line that we're just not going to cover at this point. But what we need to do is, now that we've created a virtual environment, we need to actually activate that virtual environment. So I'll go ahead and do source bin/activate. And if I list things out in here, nothing seems to have changed. The only thing that really changed was this right here. So if I clear everything out by just typing out clear, I see that my virtual environment is active. Here is the biggest kicker that didn't happen on our machine before. If I type out Python-V and hit enter, notice the version of Python. It says 3.6.8. But if I open up a new terminal window and do Python-V, it gives me 2.7. So already it's showing us that this is isolated, and that's because I'm inside of this virtual environment. Now there's this whole other thing called pip, or the Python package installer, that should also be on your system now as well. So we can actually do something called pip freeze, and this will show us the packages that are installed. Now I'm actually not going to install any packages just yet. We will do that in a little bit. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and deactivate this virtual environment. You can actually type out deactivate or even just close the window. And then I'm going to activate it again. So source bin/activate, we hit enter. What do you know? We're back in that virtual environment. And if I press up a few times on my keyboard, I can go back to that command of Python-V. So let's go ahead and deactivate that one more time. And this time I'm going to go ahead and type out Python-V, and I see, hey, what do you know? It's the wrong version of Python. So the coolest thing about the virtual environment part is when it is activated, it will have this right here. This is true with any virtual environment that's created by Python on any operating system. So if you jumped on a Windows, the actual command to activate the virtual environment is a little bit different, but the indication that you're in a virtual environment will be identical. So I am going to really emphasize that you need to use virtual environments because of one other thing. If I do this pip freeze command again on my machine with my virtual environment not activated, what I'll see is a bunch of things that are actually installed. I see that Django is already installed. I never installed Django in this virtual environment. So this is actually showing me that my system has Django installed, but my virtual environment does not, as indicated right here. Now, if this is complicated at all, no worries. This is something that you'll get the hang of as you do it a little bit more. And you know what? Let's actually do it again. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to clear everything out. We'll cd back a folder. So cd ... brings me back a folder. If I just do cd period, it does nothing. Similar to open period, we'll open up this directory. CDing into the same directory does nothing. So what I want to do is actually remove that PENV by typing it out with rm-rf PENV. Okay. So yeah, that's going to be removing that entire folder. Now, I just threw a bunch of commands at you. So perhaps you just want to delete it this way. You open up the directory, the dev folder directory, and you see PENV, and you just drag it into the trash. That's fine too. You can do it either way. The point is not to try and remember every command that you possibly can. The point is really to just understand how virtual environments work. So let's go ahead and create another one. Do you remember how it goes? In fact, I'm going to create another one, activate it, and just list everything out without saying anything else. Well, hopefully not saying anything else. Red flag should go off right there. Okay, so what happened here? A couple of things. Number one, we created a virtual environment, or seemingly created a virtual environment, and we changed into Django 3.2. Now, in my case, I actually think this folder already existed. So let's go ahead and deactivate it again. And I'm going to go ahead and try this one more time. And then we'll go ahead and do Python 3.6-m venv and pyenv 3. And this one takes a little bit longer. So we're going to cd into that one, source bin/activate, and Python-v. Great. Okay, so what the heck? I added this here. I didn't do that before. Well, this is actually a shortcut to making that directory. So what I did before was I cd into dev, I hit make dir, and we'll do pyenv4, and then I cd'd into pyenv4, and then I ran Python 3.6-m venv period. That is roughly the same thing. So these 3 lines, well, except for the cd part, but this actually creates the virtual environment in a folder called pyenv3. But I also showed you that if I already had a virtual environment created, in the case of DJ 3.2, that already existed, and it actually already has a Django project in it. We will get into that in a little bit. But the idea is I tried to create a new virtual environment where one already existed. It did not override that virtual environment. So it is actually something we want to be careful about when we are creating virtual environments. But that's just the general rule of thumb of installing Python and doing a Python virtual environment setup. And of course, to cap it off, just remember that to deactivate, you can just write out deactivate. To activate, it's literally source bin/activate. I will come back to using source bin/activate over and over. But of course, if you're watching a Windows user, it's going to be something like scripts/activate. And I'll also usually mention those as well. It's just slightly different depending on what machine you're on. Once you have a virtual environment activated, you can now use that version of Python and any packages that are installed to it. Cool. Let's go ahead and keep going. In this one, we're going to be installing Python 3.6 on your Windows machine. Now, we could totally use other versions of Python. The reason I'm using Python 3.6 has to do with third-party packages. All third-party packages that we will use in this series support 3.6. That's not always true for newer versions of Python at this time. Now, by all means, pick a different version of Python, but if you don't want to have any issues with those packages, use 3.6. So we're going to install directly from python.org. I actually recommend this as the default way to install Python. There are other ways to install Python. There's other ways to have it work. But I think for the vast majority of beginners, coming to python.org to install it is the preferred method. Okay, so what we want to do here is go into downloads. Now, of course, if you click on downloads, you're going to see this window here. Basically, we want to look for the one specifically for Windows. So if you go to the downloads, the drop-down will do this. Or if you click on Windows, same thing. And also, of course, this is the URL right here that would actually show Windows. So again, we want to find Python 3.6. So let's go ahead and do Control F and then 3.6. So I'm just searching 3.6 right here, and we want to find a version of 3.6 that works here. So we'll just go ahead and keep looking. And what I'm looking for here is a actual executable installer for 3.6. And it might take me down to 3.6.8, which it is. Now, if you're on a Mac and you watch that one, this is the exact same one I did. I'm just going to be using the Windows version of Python. Now, the vast majority of this series is going to be done on a Mac computer, but the commands running Python, running Django, all of that stuff works almost identical on our Windows. I'll mention the parts that don't, right? So if it's a little bit different on Windows, I'll definitely mention that at the time in the series itself. So you certainly can learn from it based off of Windows. Okay, so what we want to do here now is we want to download an executable installer. Okay, so there's two kinds in here. There's a 64-bit one and then a 32-bit one. For older versions of Python like this 3.6, of course, it's from 2018. That's okay. We're still learning. We're still getting things down. I will definitely mention how to use newer versions of Python in a moment. But the general idea here is we want to find the executable installer that works for our system. So I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of new Windows machines are 64-bit systems. That's probably not always true. But if you scroll up to the top, what you will see is you will see 32-bit installers as well for other versions of Python. But of course, we're going to be using 3.6.8. And so what I want to do is actually get the correct version of that. I'm going to have to go ahead and look for that again. And there we go. And so which one can we install? Now, if you have doubts and you're like, I don't know if I have a 64-bit machine, just download the 32-bit one. It'll probably still work on your machine. But if you want to know exactly what machine you have, you can go to the Start menu and then go into Settings. And inside of Settings, what we're going to want to do is go into your System and then scroll down to About. And what you'll see is the system type right there. So in my case, it's a 64-bit operating system. Of course, we could talk all day long about 32-bit versus 64-bit and what all those things actually mean, but that's not something I'm going to do. That's outside the context of this. So just get the operating system type that you need, and then you're going to want to go ahead and just download the executable installer for it, which in my case, it's this one right here. So I'm going to go ahead and download that, and then we'll go ahead and run it. So in my case, I actually already have it installed, right? So you're just going to want to walk through all of the default installation here, like all of these optional features. I would say just get all of them, and realistically, you could also install this for all users if you need. That is something that I would recommend as well. And then if there is a way to add Python to environment variables, that's another thing you're definitely going to want to select, and using the default Python installation. And of course, mine right now, I'm going to just quote unquote modify the installation. So if you made any mistakes, you can totally look at what I just did and reinstall Python at literally any time. And you can also use newer versions of Python as well. So while that finishes installing, what I'm going to show you is in my Finder, or File Explorer rather, what I want to do is actually navigate to where that's going to be loaded. So on my PC, this might actually take a moment because it's installing something. So I'm going to just let that finish installing, and then we'll be right back. All right, so mine finished installing. I'm going to close this out. And I remembered I installed it on my C drive. That's likely where you're going to install it. And notice that I have several different versions of Python in here. Python 2.7, 3.6, 3.7, 3.8. Notice that final number is not listed. And that's because, well, it doesn't really matter what that final number is. You just want to use the biggest one, essentially. Now, when you're going into production and you need more secure systems, it certainly matters. But while you're learning, it does not matter at all. And even when you're in development for things that go into production, it probably doesn't matter either. So anyways, that's where it's located. So if we actually open this up and look for the Python application, I can double click and run that. And what it does is it opens up a command line to actually run this. Now, on the screen, it's probably hard to see this. I'm going to be switching to a different program to run Python in a moment, but this is actually how you can run it. So you can say 1 + 1 and hit enter. And of course it means 2. So if we just zoom in a little bit, we will see that. And then if I do ABC equals to 1, 2, 3, and then ABC times 3, what do you know? There's Python. And if I type out exit and hit enter, it actually closes out that program. That's pretty nice. Okay, so how do I actually run this version of Python as if you were doing development itself? Now, soon we're going to be downloading a code editor called VS Code, which is actually what we'll be using most of the time to write our commands. But up until we get there, we need to use a program called PowerShell. So if you do a quick search for PowerShell, you'll find this Windows PowerShell application. This is a command line application that allows us to run all sorts of commands for our system beyond just Python, of course. There also is another one called Command Prompt. And this is a little bit older of a application. It still runs, but a lot of the commands themselves don't run the same way as they do in PowerShell. So I now have PowerShell open, and this is what I'm going to be working off of. So a good example of commands that work in PowerShell that don't work on Command Prompt is ls. ls is a command that certainly works on Linux and Mac machines, and all it's doing is listing out the items that are in any given folder, right? So that's it. That's kind of the idea behind ls. If you're using Command Prompt, you're going to use dir. So as we see, even in Windows, we have two different potential development environments that might cause quite a headache to actually just get things running. So hopefully we can override that by all using PowerShell right now. And then when we do install the text editor or the code editor called VS Code, we're going to all use that as well, again, to limit the amount of issues that are just minor but cause a lot of frustration. So what if you forgot that ls only worked on PowerShell and also on Windows machines, and then you actually were working in Command Prompt and you typed out ls here, here's the error, right? It's not a recognizable internal or external command. It's almost like you're going to have to stop in your tracks there. Well, using PowerShell will prevent that. Okay, so now that we've got this, we have PowerShell. How do I actually run this version of Python? Well, one of the ways we could do this is if we look at the properties of this Python, we could actually see what the location is. And you can also see the location right here. And inside of the details or somewhere in here, it actually gives you the location as well. I don't use those properties very often, obviously, but it is definitely in the C drive, Python 36. And then we can actually run Python from PowerShell, calling that, and then doing another slash, and then python.exe and hitting enter. That actually brings me into Python. It's much like I double click and open it, but in this case, it's actually opened inside of PowerShell so I can run all sorts of commands. So if I exit out of here, I can actually do that same thing with Python 3.7 and so on. So future versions of Python, we could totally do that. And in fact, I believe I have Python 2.7 on here as well. And what do you know? I can even run Python 2.7. This is one of the beauties of open source. They actually make it possible to run different versions of Python on your machine. Think of it like you can't run Windows XP and Windows 10 at the same time, but you totally can run Python, different versions of Python at the same time, which I think is really cool. So, sorry if you already know that, but I think learning these things for beginners is one of those things that's kind of cool and important. So when it comes to using Python, there is another aspect where I said adding Python as an environment variable. Well, if I actually just type out Python, I will get a version of Python right here. Now, if you have multiple versions installed, you may or may not have 3.6 showing up just typing out Python. In fact, you might have to restart PowerShell or even restart your entire system for these things to hold where you can actually type out Python. So on Windows, especially, writing out the absolute path to Python is going to be important from the beginning. Now, it's only important until we actually use a virtual environment, which is what we'll do in a moment. But the idea here is if you can get this far, you're certainly ready to create what's called a virtual environment. So it makes it a little bit easier to manage the Python that we're using, as well as all of the versions of code that we are going to be using as well, like the version of Django and the version of many other third-party packages. So what we need to do is we need to actually find a folder that we're going to store all of our development code in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a directory, so mkdir, in the root of my user directory, which is this right here. I'm going to make a directory called dev, D-E-V. This is just a folder that I always create for my projects. You can totally call it something different, but the idea is call it something that you'll remember and that's where you're going to put all of your code in. Now, as you see here, I already have a folder called dev, and we can actually look at this directory with II period. And if I hit II period, it will open up the file explorer and show me all of the files inside of the folder that I'm currently in, which is in the root of my user folder. Now, II period is a Windows command. If I try open period, which is a Mac command, it will not work. So II is one of those things, just slightly different. Again, I will mention this whenever I need to open a particular folder in this case. So now what I want to do, again, listing everything out with ls, what I want to do is I want to change directories into this dev folder right here. So to do that, I go cd dev. Now you can try it out with lowercase or you can try it out with uppercase. It doesn't actually matter. So we're going to go ahead and open up this folder and hit enter. And I have a number of items in here. Now, one of the things I'm not going to do right now is actually create our Try Django project. I'm not going to do that one yet. Instead, what I want to do is give you some experience creating virtual environments and why they're so amazing. So what we're going to do is we're going to make dir, and we're going to call this py36. And then I'm going to go ahead and cd into or change directory into py36. And of course, if I list everything out, I don't actually have anything in there. So what I want to do now is initialize a virtual environment. So what a virtual environment does is it helps your Python projects, really only Python projects, be isolated from other Python projects. We'll see what this means in a moment. So I'll go ahead and do C:/Python 36 and then /python.exe, and then -m for module venv, and then a period at the very end. Now, the reason I'm using a period here also has the same reason as II period. It's within this current directory. II period opens up that folder in the File Explorer, and then period at the end of this one will actually create a virtual environment in this folder as well. And this is an absolute path to that. Notice that C is actually lowercase, so it's certainly possible that that could be an error. Let's go ahead and hit enter and see what happens. And there we go. So I'm going to just give it a moment. What's happening right now is Python is actually creating the necessary files for a virtual environment. So if I list things out, I see that I have a couple folders and a file called pyvenv.cfg. So the Python virtual environment config file. And now I can actually use this virtual environment, but to use it, I have to activate it. And it's ./scripts/activate. Now, dot means to execute in this case. So execute the script called activate. And if I hit enter, we see this in front of it. So this denotes that I actually have Python working on here, or at least the Python virtual environment. And so I can actually do Python-V and hit enter, and it shows me the version of Python I'm using. And of course, if I go into Python, it will show me that as well. Now, this actually worked out really nicely because my system version is 3.6 when you type out Python, like I showed you a little bit ago. So we actually want to take a look at this with a different version of Python, just so you know how to do it. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to deactivate the virtual environment just by typing out deactivate. And now this is gone. And so we're good to go. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cd back and then do II period. And I'm going to delete that new folder here, right? So let's go ahead and go by name, and I'm going to delete py36. So we'll just do shift delete and gone. Okay. So what this will actually do is it will delete everything related to the virtual environment. It might take a minute because Python did actually create files. I'm going to leave it to be deleted. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new virtual environment. So kind of recapping what we just did using Python 3.7. Because in my case, I actually have Python 3.7 installed. You don't have to do this part. You could totally use Python 3.6 again. But if I do Python 37, python.exe-V, I can see that I do have that one installed. So if I use that same thing with -m, venv, and now say py37 and hit enter, notice that I didn't use a period this time. Instead, I actually gave the name of the folder I wanted to use. So if I scroll up a little bit, what I will see is that original command. So we did make dir py36, and then I actually created the Python virtual environment in here as well, which looks like the command just went away. But the general idea is when you just run this command right here, it'll actually create a brand new folder for you, which will be evident inside of our dev folder. We see that that folder was created. So it's sort of shortcut a step, if you will. But, you know, that part gets a little confusing every once in a while as well. So you might miss that. But if you go into py37, we see all of the different files in here as well. And so we want to do this one more time. And I'm going to do it with py36 again, just to show you how easy it is to use two different kinds of versions of Python. And also, oops, I made a mistake, as you probably have noticed. But we're going to go ahead and go back. And let's try and delete that one more time. So let's go up. And this time I'll do py36. And this time I'll just call it py3 to shortcut it a little bit. And so I just wanted to show you the different versions of virtual environments, or how you actually create these virtual environments, so you can see that two different versions of Python and two different versions of the project can work next to each other. Because as a beginner, the version changes do cause a lot of issues. So let's go ahead and activate the first one. So scripts/activate. and then we'll go ahead and do Python-V. Notice it's Python 3.7.7. Now the version of Python doesn't matter so much. It's those third-party packages, as I mentioned a while ago. And so we see that the virtual environment's activated and it's using this version of Python. If I exit out of here, exit out of the virtual environment with deactivate, not exit like we are exiting out of Python. I'm going to go ahead and CD back, and we're going to go ahead and CD into Pi 3. And then again, we'll go ahead and scripts/activate and Python-V, capital V. And again, Python 3.6.8. And if we scroll up, Python 3.7.7. Okay, so that is installing Python and activating virtual environments. Time and time again, you will need to do this. So if this was really uncomfortable for you, I have a whole series for installing Python on your Windows machine. And I will also say this is not the only way to create virtual environments. I've just come to find that the built-in virtual environment manager is the easiest one for the vast majority of beginners, but there are other ones out there. There's one called pipenv, which I used to really like using. There's another one called Poetry. There's a lot out there, even something called Anaconda, but Anaconda also installs Python for you, so I don't recommend that with Django. But the general idea is we want to isolate our code from other versions of Python and other third-party versions. That's really the gist of this. And so if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Of course, going forward, we're going to be back on that Mac machine. But as you see here, it's actually going to be hopefully very similar. I'm not going to divert too many of the commands from what you would also be doing on PowerShell. So again, let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, let's keep going. All right, so now that we have Python 3.6 installed, we can verify it by typing out the command to execute Python, which of course is just this command, Python 3.6, and then -V. That gives us that version. Now, of course, if you're on Windows, you're probably well aware this is what you're going to have to type out, something very similar to this, but it should give you the same sort of version. And of course, if you also type in Python 3.6, you should actually be in the Python shell, the Python interpreter here, which of course is where we should all be now. If you aren't here, then definitely go back and watch the setup process. Now, since we are here, I can absolutely create a virtual environment for Python 3.6 and then install Django and start a Django project. That's actually what we want to do here now. So what I'm going to do is navigate into my dev folder, and I'm going to make a directory called try-Django, and I'm going to cd into try-Django. And I'm going to clear out here, and then I'll just list everything out, dir if you're on a Windows or pwd if you're on Mac, to see exactly where you are. Okay, so now that we're in this folder, I'm going to go ahead and create a virtual environment. Now, if you haven't done this before, well, then you're really not listening to me. So hopefully you've done this before, and we just type out the executable for Python 3.6, and then we'll do -m as in -module, venv period, and it's going to create that virtual environment. Now, we are going to do this a lot as a beginner of creating virtual environments because it's critical to know how to do it to isolate our code. So I'm going to go ahead and do source bin/activate to activate my virtual environment. And of course, if you're on Windows, it's /script/activate like that. I'm on Mac, so those slight changes I already talked about to you Windows users. Okay, so now we need to use a package called pip. But the question is, how do we know what package it is that we're trying to install? Now, of course, we're using Django, so it's pip install Django, and that's the command. That's what we'll use most of the time. But the thing is, I don't want to just go off of this command without really knowing what pip is and where I can find other kinds of packages. So this brings me to pypi.org. Now, pypi.org is a place to find, install, and Python packages. This is third-party code. So if you think of Python code as something you can write, so kind of like a book, if you wrote a book in English or any other language, where would that book live? Perhaps it would live at the library. So I think of this Python package index as a big library of third-party packages that people can publish, and you can do it as well. And I have a whole series on how to do it. So in here, we can search for Django. So of course, there are going to be a lot of things related to Django. These are those third-party packages that I was mentioning. And if you see something like, hey, this one is from 2018, so there's a chance that this hasn't been updated in a long time, but it still could potentially work for your project. I'm not going to cover that right now, but do keep in mind that there are still valid old packages. They just might be for older versions of Django. So if you want to test them out, you totally can in a way that I'm going to show you in just a moment. So as we see, the very top one is Django 3.2.5. So this, of course, is one way to find the actual way to install Django, right? This is actually the way I do not recommend. Instead, what I recommend is going to djangoproject.com and then going into download and going for the LTS release, the long-term support release. That's why we're doing Django 3.2, is because it's the LTS. This is going to be supported, as you'll see in the Django documentation. It's going to be supported well into 2024. So that means that you can use the LTS in production, securely in production, with bug fixes, with all the great stuff that Django has until 2024. And at that time, you'll probably upgrade to 4.2. These smaller or more minor versions aren't as big of a deal as the LTS. These are the ones I always recommend to use, although there are those of you out there who love the newest version, so you're going to want to switch to the newest version all the time, which is fine. You can totally do that. But in this series, I do recommend that you stick with me on 3.2 and the LTS version. And that's always my rule of thumb, is like if you're watching a video or you're looking through a book that's using a different version of Django, just stick with that version, because Django is Django. It does change over time, but it's not so drastic that it's impossible to learn Django. But these little bugs that occur because you're a beginner, or even if you aren't a beginner in Python, those little bugs just get really annoying when you want to use a different version than that's in the video or that's in the book. So that's a long-winded way to say, let's go ahead and install Django now. So pip install, and what we're going to do is we're going to use quotes here, and I'm going to do Django greater than or equal to 3.2, comma, less than 3.3. And if I hit enter, what this is going to do is it's going to install the latest version of 3.2 that's less than 3.3, or that next version number. Now, if we look back in the documentation, there is going to be no 3.3. But this isn't so much for Django specifically, but it's for pip. So this is how we can actually install a version that's between two versions. And the version you'll get might be different than the version I have on screen, but it will have the latest bug fixes, which I think is important. So you will have 3.2. Those are the numbers that are important, not the last number, unless you have bug fixes that have to occur. So you might be seeing 3.2.10 by the time you're watching this. It really depends. So again, that command is this right here. Okay. So you can do this with any Python package. So any pip package you need, this is a really clean and easy way to get a version that's in between major release versions. Now, of course, you can do another thing, and that is installing a specific version, which is like this, and using the double equals there, and that will actually give you that specific version, which I think is cool as well. So if you had a case where you needed a very specific version, this will do that. Now, in my case, you may have noticed that it installed several other things that are related to Django. Now, we don't actually have to install those. Pip did that for us. That's a really cool thing about pip. And also a really cool thing about virtual environments, right? So in here, I've got Python version is 3.6.8. Now, if I opened up a new terminal window or PowerShell, depending on what you're on, and if I did pip freeze, I may or may not see that same version of Django. Now, in this case, I actually do have that same version of Django installed, but I also have other things installed. This is that isolation I keep talking about. It's not actually fully isolated from your system, but it is isolated from these packages, right? So if I didn't have these packages in here, I wouldn't have them in here, and vice versa, right? So we can actually separate those packages out, and they are specific to that version of Python that you're using inside of your virtual environment, which I think is pretty cool too. Now that we've got this, we've got Django installed, we have Python installed, we have a virtual environment. It's time to actually create a Django project. So one of the things that you might want to do is actually type out python-m and then something like Django. right? So what this is a Django management command. So notice that I can actually call it with just python-m Django. Now, Windows users, you're probably going to find this incredibly useful because now I can actually do all sorts of commands. Now, Mac and Linux users, you'll probably see that Django-admin most likely will work, and it will most likely give you the exact same commands. At least it should give you the same commands because these are both of the command line interface or, CLI for Django. That's essentially what's happening here. Now, this isn't the only way we're going to work with our projects, as you'll see. But the point is we needed to know, how do we actually start a Django project? And there's a command inside of the Django CLI to actually start that project. So I'm going to do it that works for everybody, which is python-m Django, and then start project, and then try Django, or the name of the project, whatever we want to name it is what we're going to put here. And then the directory we want to put it in, right? So if I leave no period, it's going to just put it into a new directory. If I put a period there, it's going to put it within the current directory. I'm going to do both things so you can see it. So first off, try Django, I put a period at the end, and then I'm going to go ahead and do try Django, not this one or whatever. And oops, I put a period at the end again. Notice it gives me an error. This is great. Django's command line interface is awesome. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter here. Now it created something else. We'll take a look at that in a moment. I'm also going to go ahead and use the Django-admin and start project and delete me. Hit enter. Okay. So in theory, I just created 3 projects. I did 4 commands for those 3 projects, but only 3 of them were successful. The very first one, the one we might use, we'll see. The second one was not successful, the third one, and then the fourth one. Okay, so if I open up this folder, open period is what you'll use on Mac. If you're on Windows, you use II period. It will also open up that folder in the File Explorer for your Windows users. So what we see here is several things. Okay, so we've got virtual environment stuff. We also have a folder called Try Django. We have a file called manage.py. We also have this Try Django, not this one. Notice there's manage.py or manage.py in there as well. And then there's also another one called delete me, also with manage.py. Okay, cool. Not groundbreaking, not at all. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to delete that whole thing. Oh no. Well, that is because I want to do that all over again from the top. So we're going to cd into dev. Now I'm going to go ahead and make a directory called try-django. We're going to cd into try-django. Do you remember what we do here? Now that we've created a brand new folder, what is it that we need to do? Hopefully you remember Python 3.6, we create a virtual environment, and we're going to create it inside of this directory. So we use a period there, and that will take a moment. I'll go ahead and activate that virtual environment, and then we're going to go ahead and do pip install, double quotes, Django greater than or equals to 3.2, comma, less than 3.3 or 4.0. It doesn't really matter as far as that second number, just so that it's greater than 3.2. And so that's going to take a moment to install all of the related packages. Once we've got that, we can actually do pip freeze, and we can see the things that are installed. You can also do the optional upgrade of pip. That's completely up to you at this point. Now I'm going to go ahead and create that Django project. The one that we might use, I might also redo it again because this is something you should be very comfortable with as a new Django developer. So I'm going to go ahead and do python-m Django, start project, and try Django. And then I'm going to do period because I want it in this current directory. Now I'm actually not going to hit enter just yet. You totally can. It's okay. But if I list everything out in here, I see only virtual environment stuff. That's important, right? You only want to see virtual environment stuff. So now I'll actually run this command and we will see all of the new things related to Django, which really is just manage.py and this other folder called Try Django. So this is the project configuration folder. We'll go over all of those things as we start to build more of this out. But that's just the general idea. So we have manage.py and Try Django. Now, if we actually type out Python manage.py, we will see very similar commands that we saw before. They're actually a bit different because we now actually have a Django project. So it does have some overlap commands. but it's not the same commands, right? So we can go up and actually take a look at that with python-m Django, hit enter. Now notice that it has this warning of installed apps, Django settings module, what's going on. And then it only has the Django subcommands, right? So it didn't have all of them. Now, do you need to know all this stuff just yet? Probably not. Is it a little overwhelming? Maybe. But the thing is, we're going to go through all of this. We're going to figure this all out together. So you just got to stick with me. You just got to trust me that I'm going to take you through this and make it nice and easy to really grasp all the things that are going on. Now, these commands are not something you want to remember. The things that you want to remember is what I just reiterated was creating a virtual environment, installing Django, and then running this start project thing. Those are the things that you're going to want to remember. Now, at some point, the pip freeze, this installation right here, we're going to want to make reference to that. So I'm actually going to do it now just so you're aware of it. And then we're going to go ahead and do it again another time. So I'm going to use this command called echo. I'm going to paste in that. And then I'm going to use the greater than sign. And I'm going to put this into requirements.txt. Now, if you're on Windows, I do not believe that echo works in this manner. It might. You can give it a shot. But the idea is we want to give a line of requirements.txt. We hit enter. And all of that did was it just copied this command into requirements.txt. Another way to think about doing this is doing pip freeze and then a greater than sign and requirements.txt. That way, that's another way to do it. And that's just putting all of the requirements into requirements.txt because we want that reference. Okay. Now, this is not incredibly important right at this moment, but it will be important in the future, and I will come back to it at the future. So if we do cat requirements.txt, I can also see those same requirements. So cat is just echoing what's inside of requirements.txt. And if I open this up again, so I period, or if you're on Windows, and if you're on Windows, you might have to open up Notepad or wait until we actually get VS Code going, and you can actually see those version requirements again. And so the final thing to think about here is we can actually do pip install-r requirements.txt, and that will actually install all of those requirements again. But it's now actually referencing them, so we can use it again in the future, right? So we don't actually have to remember exactly everything about this project, every version that we might ever use. We just need to remember some of them and add them to a file called requirements.txt, which is incredibly common for a virtual environment. And it is a best practice to call it requirements.txt. Cool. So let's go ahead and keep going. And now what we want to do is actually set up our text editor, the actual code editor that we'll use to do all of the things that we've been doing. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and set up our Django project on VS Code or Visual Studio Code. So go to code.visualstudio.com and just download the version for your machine. It is free and cross-platform. Those are the keys, free and cross-platform. It also has a huge community of people or developers that build all sorts of great things for it. Now, this is not Visual Studio. Visual Studio is a different kind of text editor. We're not going to worry about that. It's also not free. Sublime Text is a text editor I've used in the past. Also not free, but it does have a free version. I actually really still like Sublime Text, but Visual Studio Code just has a lot of features, a lot of extensions really that make it the best for me. Atom's another option. PyCharm's another option. I don't use those myself. I have tried them out, but Visual Studio Code or VS Code is by far my favorite. So go ahead and download it, install it, and then once you do that, come on back and take a look at this, right? So you're going to want to open up VS Code and notice that it is called code. And this is where we now need to actually start our new project. So you're going to see a welcome screen much like this. Now, for me, I actually do not like seeing the welcome page on startup. So go ahead and get rid of that. And so what we want to do now is we're actually going to create a brand new project from scratch. So the entire folder, a virtual environment, installing Django, adding a requirements file, all of that, everything we just did. Now, the reason to do this is to get good at it. That's it. And to really emphasize the commands that we really need to know now and the things we really need to know now. versus everything that we could possibly learn. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new folder. So inside a file, you're going to want to actually add a folder to this workspace. Okay, so go ahead and add folder to workspace. Now, another way to do this is by clicking on the Explorer here. This will actually toggle this side window here, and you can open up a folder there. But I'm actually going to go ahead and add a folder to workspace. This is typically what I like to do, because if you already have a folder in here, in my case, I have the Django folder already created, but there's nothing in it, you could absolutely go ahead and use that. But again, let's go ahead and do it as if nothing even exists. So I'm going to delete that Django folder, and we'll go ahead and create a brand new one, try-Django. And, obviously go ahead and hit create, and then go ahead and hit add. So this is now in our workspace here. Okay. So this is not necessarily a folder that VS Code recognizes as a workspace. So I can also then go into file, and I want to save this workspace. So eventually I'm going to go ahead and save the workspace inside of here, inside of Django. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and add a requirements.txt file in here. And if you remember, we had something for Django that was greater than or equals to, and that was 3.2, and then comma, less than 3.3. We actually created that requirements file before, right? No big deal. It now has a way to create it. So we're actually going to use this requirements file to install Django instead of the way we did it before. Okay, so inside of Django, now I'm going to go ahead and try and save this workspace as. So for whatever reason, mine's not showing up correctly. So what I want to do then is I'm just going to go ahead and maybe open a new window. Yeah, so now it's actually showing up. Maybe a little bug on the video I have, or the VS Code version I have. Of course, they update new versions all the time. Worst case scenario, I open up a new window and just navigate to that folder again. But now I'm going to go ahead and save this workspace in here as just simply try-Django. Okay, so this workspace is something I'll be able to open again. So if I actually close out that window, navigate to my dev folder, open up that workspace, it should give me basically the exact same stuff, right? Kind of even, potentially even the state that I left it in where these two files were open. Okay, cool. So that's some minor VS Code basics. But now what I want to do is I want to install a couple things. First off, clicking on the extensions, I want to go ahead and do a search for Python. Now, in some sense, I think the extension for Python is a cheat, right? So you're like sort of cheating yourself using an extension when you're learning more about Python. However, it will also make sure that the bugs and the things that you face aren't too challenging, right? So I don't want tiny little errors to get in the way of your progress. Those tiny errors you can always get into more depth later. So download and install this. You'll probably see an install button. Go ahead and install that. Restart VS Code if you have to. But of course, there are other ones. I typically use the one from Microsoft that has a lot of downloads, right? So nearly 40 million downloads for that one. But of course, there's another one from Thomas Townsend. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. 3 million downloads, right? So there are other ones out there. They are third-party extensions. So definitely be careful on the third-party extensions because sometimes they might have malicious code. I don't think the ones that have millions of downloads do, but certainly we want to use IntelliSense on Python from Microsoft itself. Okay, that's the only extension we'll talk about now. So we've got our extension installed. We have our folder ready. We have a requirements file. Now it's time to actually create our virtual environment. Now the question is, how do we create that? Now, do we actually open up Terminal, open up a new terminal window or PowerShell, and CD into that folder, right? So of course, all of these things exist as we see right here. And you totally could create it in here. You could totally use Terminal to create it. But I want to do everything inside of VS Code. The cool thing about VS Code that not every text editor or code editor has is a built-in terminal that's easy to use. So inside of here, we can go in and click on New Terminal, or you can use Control and tilde. So tilde will open up a new terminal window for you. It will also close it, so it just toggles it. And if you're not familiar with what tilde looks like, it's that right there. And of course, it might be different on different parts of the world. So by all means, look at the shortcut that's listed here, right? So in my case, it's Control and backtick actually, but we can think of it as tilde or backtick, either one, because in my case, the keyboard has both of them there. So backtick and tilde. Okay. Anyway, so now I actually have this terminal window, but one of the coolest things about it is if I PWD or dir if you're on Windows. So if you do PWD, you see that you're in the same folder already. So you don't have to navigate to the folder that your workspace is in. This is like such a cool thing to just shortcut about, with your actual project. So now what I'm going to do is use Python 3.6. And then again, we'll check the version. And if you're on Windows, you're probably going to have to do C:python 36. Let's type it out correctly. And python.exe. And you'll do -v or -m, venv, and period, much like what we're going to do in just a second. So we'll go ahead and create that virtual environment and hit enter. Okay, cool. So one of the things you'll notice is this down here. It says Python 3.8.2, especially if you have the Python extension installed from VS Code. That is something that's important. We actually want to change that. And so what you're going to do is you're going to select that button and it's going to open this up. And we want to actually try to select the interpreter that we want. So we're going to click on that. And then we're going to click on Enter Interpreter Path. And we'll go ahead and do Find. And what we want to do here is we want to find the version of Python that our virtual environment's using. So typically it's going to be in the bin. And if you're on a Windows, I believe it's also in bin. It might be in scripts. But the idea is you want to find the Python shortcut. Whatever that Python is, we're going to go ahead and grab that and select that interpreter. Notice that in my case, it actually changes to 3.6.8. You don't have to do this. It's just a good idea in my opinion. So next thing, once we actually have our terminal open and we have our virtual environment here, I'm going to go ahead and do source bin/activate or /script/activate if you're on Windows. Cool. So the other nice thing about this is I can actually create another terminal window and open that up. So if I hit the plus here, it's changed over time on how this actually works, but I can actually toggle between different terminal windows and I can source bin/activate in either one. Pretty cool. So with that, I can also delete out that terminal window, as you see there. And now I just have one. Okay, so now what I want to do is install Django with pip install Django or pip install -r, as in use a requirements file from requirements.txt. And notice that it's installing between those two versions. So this is definitely something that I'm going to want to keep for the long run. But that's the general idea is I need to install it here. We've already seen this. And then I'm going to go ahead and run python-m and we'll go ahead and use Django. And we're going to run start project try Django and make sure we put a period at the end so that the root of the virtual environment folder is where the root of the Django project is, also known as where manage.py is, next to all of these other things. Cool. So we now have our Django project set up inside of VS Code. So if you've never done this before and it was too fast, I totally get you. If you have done this before and it was too slow, I get you too. The thing is, we all need to be on the same page to move forward, because once we're on the same page as far as our setup process is concerned, we can do a lot more going forward. So let's go ahead and keep going. Hey, if you've gone this far, nice work. Hopefully now you have Python installed on your machine and you also know a little bit about VS Code, the actual text editor we'll be using to write out our code in the Try Django series. So you're actually ready for that. So feel free to click the link in the description or it'll be in the card somewhere around here. So be sure to check out the Try Django 3.2 series now. Now, I've been doing that Try Django series for a while, and there's a good chance that there's an older Try Django series that you can learn from as well, because I try to make different projects per Try Django series so you can see how these projects are approached. So be sure to check out all of the Try Django series if you're really wanting to master and learn Django. And of course, I have some more advanced things on my website. Feel free to take a look at that as well. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time.